Kia ora, good morning everyone, Zhongyi here. Welcome back to the channel. This is the new Speedmaster 50mm T1.0 Micro Four Thirds lens from Zhongyi, or you may know them as Mitakon. It has an ultra-fast T1.0 maximum aperture, and it is also a very affordable Cine lens. And I think it looks super cool. So let's have a look at this lens in this review and see whether it is a good lens or not. This Zhongyi Speedmaster 50mm T1.0 lens is the fourth Cine lens from Zhongyi's T1.0 Cine lens series. The previous three lenses are the 17mm T1.0, 25mm T1.0, and 35mm T1.0. This is a fully mechanical and fully manual lens, and it's not really a small lens in Micro Four Thirds standard. It is a little bit bigger than the Leica 12-16 f2.8-4 lens, but to be fair, for a T1.0 Cine lens, it's not too bad in terms of size. All the four Zhongyi T1.0 Cine lenses have very similar size. Actually, the 17mm, 25mm, and 35mm have the same identical dimensions, and this 50mm is only 3mm longer, but with the same diameter and also takes 77mm front filter. Now, while I don't have the previous Zhongyi Cine lenses with me to do some side-by-side comparisons, but I was told by Zhongyi that if you use follow focus system, you don't have to readjust the position if you are switching between these Cine lenses. This lens has a very solid metal construction, and since it is a Cine lens, so both the focus ring and the iris ring are geared rings, so you can attach a follow focus system on it. I love the yellow numbers and the markings on the lens. It is just beautiful and also very easy to read as well. All the markings are engraved onto the lens rather than just printed, so not only make the lens look and feel more premium, but also make sure the markings won't rub off very easily. The focus distance and the T-stop markings are also on the side of the lens, just like most of the high-end Cine lenses. The focus ring is at the front, and the focus throw is 165 degrees, which is the same as the other Zhongyi Cine lenses. Now, I imagine a lot of users will be using this lens with a follow focus system to control the focus. The focus ring is just so smooth and it feels so satisfying when you are turning it. It is also a little bit more loose than the typical photo lenses to allow you to do smooth focus transition. It's been a while since I last used a lens that has such a smooth focus ring. You can see the front element move when you are adjusting the focus, but the overall length of the lens doesn't change. Another thing I want to mention is that the focus distance marking appear to be very accurate as well. Well, I didn't check every single marking, but I checked a few and they all seems to be spot on. Then we have the iris ring at the back, and it is also very smooth, and the aperture throw is 60 degrees, which is also the same as the previous Zhongyi T1.0 Cine lenses. So overall, I really love the design and the build quality of this lens. It looks great and it also feels great when you are shooting with it. Now let's have a look at the image sharpness, and let's zoom in the center at 200%. At T1.0, the center is soft, and you can also see a bit of chromatic aberration and glow effect. Stop down to T1.4, the center image quality becomes a lot more solid. The chromatic aberration and glow effect becomes not so noticeable. At T2.0, I would say the center is sharp. There is still a little bit of chromatic aberration, and at T2.8, I don't see any chromatic aberration anymore, and the center is now very sharp. It remains the same until T11, when the image starting to become a bit soft due to diffraction. Now let's have a look at the corner. I'm going to show you two results side by side. One shot with the photo, focus at the center, and one focus at the corner. At T1.0, the corner is a bit soft, but to be honest, I was expecting it would be even softer, so I'm a bit surprised. Another thing that is a little bit interesting is that I also don't really see much of the glow effect that I see at the center at T1.0. When I first saw the results, I thought I may have done something wrong, maybe missed focus a little bit, so I repeat the test again, actually 2 times on separate days, and my results were still pretty much the same. So I will be very interested to see if the other reviewers noticed the same thing or not. At T1.4, the corner sharpness becomes quite a bit better, and at T2, the corner is already quite sharp. And I was testing it on a 25 megapixel GH6, so if you are shooting with a lower resolution Micro Four Thirds camera or shooting video, the corner would be very sharp for you at T2 already. The maximum corner sharpness can be reached at around T4 to T5.6. After that, the corner sharpness remains very good until T16 when diffraction kicks in. The minimum focus distance of this lens is 60 cm, and that gives us the maximum magnification ratio of 0.1 time, which is not bad at all. When shooting at the minimum focus distance and at T1.0, the image is a little bit soft and also has some noticeable color fringing. But then you will probably struggle to get the correct focus as the depth of field is really narrow at T1.0 and minimum focus distance. So if you stop down to T1.4, then that would improve the sharpness noticeably, and also the color fringing would also mostly disappear. At T2.0, the sharpness becomes pretty decent, and now you also have a little bit more usable depth of field. There are usually 2 reasons why people will be interested in buying an ultra-fast T1.0 lens. One is to allow better low light performance, but since most cameras these days have pretty good high ISO performance, so I think for most people who want an ultra-fast lens is to get that shallow depth of field look. And it's mainly about how the lens can dissolve the background when you are shooting at the maximum aperture or close to it. So bokeh quality is very important for this lens. And the bokeh does look pretty nice in general with this lens. The bokeh balls are round even when you stop down thanks to the 9 aperture braid, and the background is usually dissolved smoothly and looks pleasant. And because of the ultra-fast T1.0 aperture and the 50mm focal length, you could indeed create some background-foreground separation quite easily even when your subject is a couple of meters away. The only negative thing I want to mention is that when shooting at T1.0, the bokeh at the corner or near the edge of the frame is quite often not exactly round. It will look a bit like a jelly with the top facing the edge of the photo. This is something I have previously noticed with some of the Zhongyi Speedmaster lenses as well. But still, I think overall bokeh rendering from this 50mm T1.0 lens is pretty nice. It looks pleasant with a bit of character. When shooting at T1.0, vignetting is very noticeable, but this is kind of expected for such an ultra-fast lens. At T1.4, it improved a lot. When stopped down to T2.0, vignetting becomes quite minor, and from T2.8 onwards, vignetting isn't really visible anymore. So overall, I think this Zhongyi lens vignetting performance is pretty acceptable. When I do lens review, usually I would like to spend the first few days or even up to a week just go out and shoot some real-world photos or video with the lens and check the results before I start to do the more controlled test photos. And with this Zhongyi lens, one thing I noticed very early when I was shooting the real-world photo and video is that chromatic aberration is pretty obvious, and I can see color fringing through the electronic viewfinder or the LCD screen when I am shooting video without even punching the scene. This is pretty noticeable when I'm shooting at T1.0. However, chromatic aberration would become much less noticeable once I stop down the lens a little bit. Even at T1.4, there is already a lot less color fringing. So if you don't want to have too much color fringing in your photo or video, you need to stop down the lens a little bit. Otherwise, you have to rely on post-processing to minimize the chromatic aberration in your scene. Let's have a look at distortion now, and that means time to look at another brick wall photo. So look at this brick wall photo. There is a small amount of barrel distortion, but it is quite minor. I just need to apply a +2 distortion correction in Lightroom, and I can largely remove the barrel distortion in this brick wall photo. And when I'm shooting real-world photos or videos, distortion is usually not noticeable, so I don't think it would be a problem for most users. When I review the previous Zhongyi lenses, I noticed lens flare is usually one of the biggest weaknesses, and this time, well, I have some good news and bad news for you. The bad news is, it's still quite easy to see lens flare and especially ghosting when shooting with this lens. Pretty much every time when I'm shooting into a bright light source, I will see some ghosting. And when I'm shooting at T1.0, there will quite often be an additional ring-shaped ghosting as well. However, the good news is, first, if you don't like that ring-shaped ghosting, you just need to stop down the lens slightly to around T1.2, 1.3, and that ring-shaped ghosting will be gone. But to me, I actually don't mind that. I think the ghosting from this Zhongyi lens, including the ring-shaped ghosting, looks pretty nice to me, and it definitely doesn't look too distracting. And while the contrast would drop a bit when there is strong lens flare, I feel it adds a bit of cinematic look, which I like. But I think this is quite a subjective thing, so have a look at my test footage and maybe let me know whether you like the lens flare and ghosting from this Zhongyi lens or not. This Zhongyi lens has a 9-braid aperture design, so that means it could render 18-point Sunstars when you stop down the lens, and you need to stop down the lens to around T5.6 for Sunstars to appear, and at T11, Sunstars become quite sharp. So if you are someone who like the more complex looking Sunstars, then you may like the 18-point Sunstars from this Zhongyi lens. Okay, now let's talk about Coma, which is the butterfly-shaped artifact that you will see at the edge of the frame when there is a point light source there. So this Zhongyi lens is not really handling Coma very well. At T1.0, there is some pretty obvious Coma. It gets better as we stop down the lens, but I can still see some Coma quite easily at T2.0, and I have to stop down the lens a little bit more to avoid that. A high-end Cine lens usually has very little amount of focus breathing, but since this Zhongyi 50mm T1.0 lens is more like an entry-level Cine lens and it is not a wide-angle lens as well, so it does have a bit of focus breathing. If you look at my 1 meter to infinity focus breathing test footage, focus breathing is quite easy to see. However, when shooting real-world scenes when there is a focus transition but not with such extreme range, focus breathing is not that noticeable, so I think for most users it should be quite acceptable. Okay, so what's my final thoughts about this Zhongyi 50mm T1.0 Cine lens? Well, in terms of image quality, it is easy to see this lens shares some of the common issue with a lot of the affordable ultra-fast lenses. A bit soft and also has quite a bit of chromatic aberration when shooting at the maximum aperture, and there's also a bit of lens flare and ghosting. So if you are someone who wants a technically perfect lens, this is not a great choice for you. But we have to remember we are looking at an ultra-fast lens that is also very affordable. So I think we have to be realistic, and some of these flaws are just pretty much the price that we have to pay for. It's just not reasonable to expect a T1.0 lens at this price that is flawless in image quality. On the positive side, I really love the build quality of this 50mm T1.0 lens. It is solid with the really nice and smooth focus and iris ring. It's a joy to shoot with this lens no matter you're shooting with or without a follow focus and a rig. And despite some of the image quality flaws that I just mentioned, the photo and video that it captures actually looks very pleasing to my eyes, and definitely something that can only be achieved with such an ultra-fast lens. So if you want that extreme shadow depth of field look with a bit of character or the ability to shoot under really low light and you have a limited budget, this Zhongyi 50mm T1.0 Cine lens and the other lenses in the same series are surely something that you should consider. By the way, if you're interested in Cine lenses for your camera, you should check out my review of the PD Movie Live Air 2S, which is a wireless follow focus system that I find works really well and it is extremely compact as well.